This week's mini lecture is about conflict and negotiation. Much of what's contained in this Prezi regarding conflict are topics that we've already gone over in class or in the readings, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those things. However, I will spend a little bit of time on some incremental information regarding conflict before moving on to negotiation. Conflict is defined as the point at which interaction between two parties becomes inter-party disagreement. There are two views of conflict, the traditional view and the interactionist view. The traditional view of conflict is that of conflict as an outcome, specifically an outcome of a dysfunctional process. The traditional view also holds that there are typically one winner and one loser when it comes to inter-party conflict. The interactionist view of conflict, however, takes a perspective that conflict is a process and that there is not in fact a winner or a loser, but a process of resolving the disagreement between two parties. Two very different views, as you can see, two very different approaches to conflict. The interactionist view is one that's been adopted more both by researchers and practitioners in recent years. Types of conflict, we haven't touched on this in class, but I think you've read this already in the chapter. There's task conflict, relationship conflict, and process conflict. Process conflict is actually a better, quote-unquote, better type than others, simply because conflict over a process tends to bring out, particularly if you take an interactionist perspective, tends to bring out a problem-solving process to resolve that conflict. And so you might end up with a better process in the end. As a reminder, the locus of conflict can be one or more of intrapersonal, dyadic, meaning between two individuals, intragroup, meaning within the group, and intergroup, meaning between group conflict. The chart that you see here in front of you kind of outlines a psychological process that happens with regard to conflict. There are 5 stages. The first stage is the potential for opposition or incompatibility. Some of the antecedent conditions include communication, structure, and personal variables. One way to think of structure in terms of it being an antecedent condition for conflict is that you may have structurally within an organization 2 groups that are doing different tasks that are at odds with each other. And so, for example, I mentioned in class the other day kind of this classic tension between productivity and efficiency and quality in a manufacturing environment. So the structure of those 2 different groups can be a potential antecedent condition for conflict. The second stage involves cognition and personalization. The cognition part of it is perceived conflict. So these are thoughts about the conflict that somebody is perceiving. The personalization part of it is felt conflict, and that has to do with emotions and attitudes. So perceived conflict has to do with cognitions about the conflict. Felt conflict has to do with emotions and attitudes around the conflict. Stage 3 is intentions, and this list here should be very familiar to you because you've just done a self-assessment exercise and kind of looked at these different ways of conflict handling. In this conflict process, in stage 3, we view these as intentions. So these are intentions to behave. So an intent to behave in a competing manner or an intent to behave in a collaborating manner. Those intentions then turn into behaviors at stage 4. So at this point, conflict is happening. One party behaves one way and the other party reacts. And there can be a back and forth that goes on just in one round or many rounds. I'm sure you can think of an example of conflict that's occurred over many rounds of one party's behavior and the other party's reaction. Depending on the intentions and behavior that are carried out as part of this conflict process, there are one of 2 outcomes at stage 5 that can be experienced, either increased group performance or decreased group performance. So again, they're depending on several factors, whether or not the parties involved will take an interactionist view of conflict, what the behavioral intentions are regarding how to handle that conflict, and then the behaviors that actually happen. Those factors will contribute to whether or not there is increased or decreased group performance. This here is just an explanation of those in detail, so I'm going to move right through that pretty quickly. And into negotiations. One way that I'd encourage you to think about negotiations is as a joint decision-making process. So it's a process whereby two or more parties decide how to allocate resources. Every negotiation in organizations affects the relationship between the negotiators and the way the negotiators feel about themselves as well. There are two types of negotiations that we talk about. The first is distributive bargaining, which typically you would think of distributive bargaining as a zero-sum game or a fixed pie. Again, the idea in negotiating in a distributive bargaining situation is that one party attempts to get more of that pie than the other party. In an integrative bargaining situation, the idea there is not to have a fixed pie, but to expand the pie. And in that case, negotiations can result in win-win outcomes. It's just a little something funny for you. All right, the negotiation process has several steps, as you see here. Informal negotiations, such as procurement activities in organizations, you may formally go through every single one of these stages and take quite a bit of time, actually, in some cases, to go through these stages and do them with a great amount of detail and intent. In other cases where negotiations are less formal, you may still go through these processes, but you may go through them quicker. You may ignore them altogether. So, for example, well, I'll talk about that in a second. So the first stage in the negotiation process is preparation and planning. In a formal negotiation, this could include things like gathering data, doing some analysis, preparing your BATNA, trying to estimate what the BATNA is of the entity that you're negotiating with, And a BATNA is a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So it's basically kind of like the floor at which you will, the floor that, if you reach that floor, then the negotiation process has fallen apart. So it's basically your bottom line. So in terms of, let's say, again, negotiating a contract for something that you're going to purchase from a supplier, both you and the supplier are going to engage in extensive preparation and planning before you even come to the table. Once you come to the table, you're going to set out some ground rules. Some of these ground rules may be very formal, such as who talks and who doesn't talk, how long you talk for, at what point arbitration or mediation needs to be brought into the situation. In more informal negotiations, the ground rules may just be a matter of defining what it is that you're negotiating about in broad terms. The next step is clarification and justification, and this is where the interaction between two parties happens in the negotiation process. So each party has an opportunity to clarify and justify their position, and then start engaging in bargaining and problem solving with each other. Now these two steps can happen as a pair, can happen back and forth over a negotiation. So it's not just a one-shot clarification and justification followed by bargaining and problem solving, but once you finish bargaining and problem solving a little bit, you might come back to clarification and justification and then go back to bargaining and problem solving. So you go through that process as many times as you need to until you get to the point of closure and implementation. In the case of a formal negotiation, closure may be a formal contract that's signed by two parties, two entities, and implementation would be the execution of that contract. Something really important to understand about negotiations is that there are clear, marked gender differences in negotiations. Men place a higher value on status, power, and recognition, and they value economic outcomes more than women do. On the other hand, women place a higher value on compassion and altruism, and they value relationship outcomes more than men. Some of the implications of this are that women experience diminished economic outcomes when they negotiate. Women are more likely to be exploited in negotiations, and unfortunately, two women negotiating together are more likely to generate less total value than two male negotiators. This can be very problematic, but the good news is that interventions can be put in place to help mitigate this effect, and research supports both the fact that there are gender differences in negotiations, and research also supports the fact that even a minor intervention can greatly mitigate these gender differences. And so just to give you a specific example, some studies have been done where parties have come into a negotiation. Sometimes it's a man and a woman excuse me. Sometimes it's a man and a woman negotiating, and sometimes it's a woman and a woman negotiating. So there are mixed conditions here. All you have to do is prime the parties and tell them that women tend to negotiate better in this particular situation, and these diminished economic outcomes and exploitation, these problematic outcomes for women, tend to go away. So there's minor changes, minor things that can be done in order to kind of even the playing field between men and women when it comes to negotiations. Other things that can help mitigate this is that organizational culture should encourage a variety of negotiating styles regardless of gender. So encourage women to be more self-interested and aggressive. Encourage men to be more relationship-oriented. You can also strategically choose who you're going to engage in a negotiation based on the outcomes that are being negotiated. So if economic outcomes are valued, women should behave more aggressively and in a self-interested manner, or you may choose to have a man engage in those negotiations. If social outcomes are more valued in the particular negotiation, men should behave in a more cooperative manner, or you might choose to have a woman engage in those negotiations. And that is all I have for you on conflict and negotiation.